that one of the reasons we concentrate on air quality is because it can hinder business development and it can increase regulatory burdens on businesses. As I was thinking about this, our new PM 2.5 SIP, which I know the state and I see a lot of members of the Utah Air Quality Board here today, have put a lot of work into and done a great job. But I want to share a story with one of my clients that I think is a warning tale for all of us, and it relates to how important this issue is and how important it is we have not only conferences like this, but we look for proactive solutions. So my client, first of all, this is the non-attainment area for PM 2.5 in Utah. As you can see, it's the shaded areas in green and various shades of green and tan at the top. So the PM 2.5 area, non-attainment area, essentially means that there's a government standard for PM 2.5 and those areas exceed it. So what's the big deal about that? Well, when you have a non-attainment area, it puts certain burdens on businesses. First of all, when you go to get a new air permit for an expansion or a new facility, you have to meet this rule. And this rule requires two major things. I'm going to talk about the latter. The first is you must install the lowest achievable emission rate pollution control equipment. Now that's great news in the sense that they're putting on the absolute best pollution control equipment. The difficult part for industry often is that is often by far the most expensive pollution control equipment. So it increases costs on a new facility that's coming in or on a modified facility. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. The second major obstacle or responsibility is you must obtain emission offsets to the extent provided under other rules. In other words, if I'm going to come in and build a new factory and I'm going to put out 1 ton of PM 2.5, I have to offset it by a range, but it's always more than what I'm going to pollute. So if I'm going to pollute at 1 ton of PM 2.5, I have to offset it at 1.2 tons. Now the question is, where do I get those offset credits? And that's the difficulty my client had. So I had a client who owned property in Utah County and had worked for about a decade to develop this very nice, very sophisticated light industrial area. They'd had a lot of great jobs and businesses move into that area. They had kind of the keynote speaker, so to speak, of that conference, of that area, their foundation, getting ready to move in, who had already obtained PM offset credits. Paid a lot of money for them. They were former credits that were created from the retirement of the Geneva Steel plant, and thought that they had it wired and they were ready to build the plant. This was, I think, about 350 jobs and a very sizable facility, and they were anxious to come to Utah. They met with the Division of Air Quality, who informed them that they now needed different emission offset credits, that the ones they had obtained were no longer valid. Now the question is, why is that? It's not such a big deal for new industrial sources, because if I already own a factory, I may be able to find a way to reduce my emissions by 1.2 tons to offset the new 1 ton I've got in. But when you're a new facility, you don't have anything else going on in Utah, you have to go out and purchase these credits. So you have to purchase them from somebody else who's already reduced. The problem is, when the state developed their inventory for PM 2.5 emissions, they did not include those retired banked emissions in the inventory. Now you ask why? Well, because the state has to account for those in its plan on how to clean up. In other words, Geneva wasn't polluting at the time. It's long since retired. So it made no sense from the state's point of view, which I totally understand, to include those old emissions in the current inventory. Because if you did, it would show we have, even on paper, a much bigger problem, and you have to develop a much more stringent plan to get there. So it made sense from what the state did, but the downside of that is my client, who had purchased those credits, now had no way to obtain an air permit without finding some other emission credits. But because of the way the PM 2.5 SIP was developed, the bank that you would go to obtain your credits has essentially been wiped out. When they came to me about this issue, the PM 2.5 SIP was still in public comment. We went and met with the Division of Air Quality. They were extremely responsive. We worked together on some potential avenues to address the problem. Just going through this a little bit quicker. And one of the issues that we came up with, so what we did is we filed public comments to the PM 2.5 SIP and went and met with them. And they said, listen, Blaine, if you have any ideas, let us know, and we're going to do a ton of research too. One of the ideas that we came up with, we'll talk about in a minute, but I wanted to point out in particular the language that came back from the Division of Air Quality to show this is a real problem. this was their response to our concern about this facility. And they said, DAQ is aware of the economic constraint that will result at the completion of these PM 2.5 SIPs. So it's a recognized economic constraint in the situation. And then they go on to explain the rule that I just identified. And they went on to say there's simply no room to introduce these emission credits and still demonstrate reasonable further progress toward attainment. So had they included them in the SIP, they wouldn't have been able to show that their plans to meet the problem with PM 2.5 would be met. It was a real difficult situation for them. So one of the things that I studied and they studied was the possible development of what are called economic development zones. Now, I'll be honest, typically an economic development zone is for the Rust Belt or the Deep South with high unemployment or something else. But I was looking for any solution I could, and on paper, an economic development zone could be created in Utah. In other words, the state would have to petition EPA and say, we need so many credits, emission credits, to foster economic development in this area. Then the state holds those credits and can then use them for the offsetting requirement. The state agreed, in essence, that it was worth looking at this particular avenue to address this problem, but hadn't quite got there by the time the PM 2.5 SIP was finalized. So they went ahead and finalized it, hoping that in a future SIP revision, this is their response. The commenter makes an interesting suggestion with regard to economic development zones. Perhaps this can be explored in the future as a possible SIP revision. So that is one thing I continue to talk to the division about, is how we deal with this in the future. I bring it to your attention because it's a very real issue. It's one we're on the very front end of. And as Steve's going to get up here and talk about in a minute, right now this is a Wasatch Front problem because we have these non-attainment areas right along the Wasatch Front and up into Cache County. When we hit the ozone wall, it's a completely different set of problems. Because if the ozone levels are set at a level that makes a large majority of the state out of attainment or a non-attainment area, then suddenly a lazy boy factory that was going to locate in Brigham City or a facility that was going to locate in Delta has the exact same problems as they have along the Wasatch Front, which causes a great shift in where industry and commercial facilities will locate. Right now, as you know, there is a push to locate in some of those areas because there are quality issues. I guess the good news for property owners along the Salt Lake, in the Salt Lake areas, it'll all be an even playing field, I think, once the ozone rule comes into play. But right now, it is a very much a Wasatch Front issue, and it's one that we must address. So I bring that up again as a cautionary tale and something for you to think of. Again, we're speaking about those particular areas where a vast majority of business and commerce is done in the state of Utah.